Hi everyone! So in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to draw a horse in graphite. Now this here is going to be really focusing on a few main techniques that I like to use when drawing any horse. So to start with, I will always work on the eye first. This is where that main emotion and expression stems from, so I do want to make sure that I get that accurate before I tackle any other part of the drawing. Now horses do have quite a few wrinkles and creases on the lower parts of their eyelids, so I do want to make sure that I've got my main lights and darks in the right place. Otherwise that can really adjust the shape of that eye. Now ultimately then, if the shape of the eye is incorrect and those eyelid areas, we will change what that animal looks like, and if this is a pet portrait, we are then going to end up with an animal that doesn't resemble as much like that photograph, and obviously that would be a real problem. So we do want to make sure that the lights and darks with any element that we're working on are correct, because it will adjust the shape and expression of that animal. And this is the same when I start drawing the hair or the fur. I'm just mapping in my main lights and darks, and I'm really just getting a good accurate base layer so that I can follow that reference photo closely. If I map in my highlights and my shadows in their right places at this stage, when I go back in working with my graphite pencils as I am here, I'm already knowing where I should be positioning my shadows and my highlights. Now this is something that I put a lot of emphasis on in the real-time tutorial on Patreon. This entire tutorial from start to finish is available there now, all in real time. There are no sections cut out or sped up. It's a perfect one to follow along to with that reference photo, line art and full material list. So if this tutorial or any of my other in-depth tutorials are of interest, I will link my Patreon in the description below. Now one other thing, if you've seen many of my other tutorials here on YouTube, you'll know that I do like to work in small sections. I feel that this is, for me, the best way that I achieve the most out of my drawing. It also stops me from becoming too overwhelmed by the process. If I work on one solid layer for the entire subject and then my future layers individually from there, I do find that I spend more time hesitating, trying to think, where am I, where should I be drawing? Whereas if I'm focusing on a few square inches at a time or one element such as just one ear, I do certainly feel that I am more productive in the way that I work. Now one thing with this reference photo is because the lighting was behind the horse, this did make the ears look a little dark. But you can see some of those mid-tone highlights and the way that that fluffier inner ear hair is all grouped together. In this instance, I don't want to be adding too many details because not only will I be making the inner ear texture far too textured and wiry, but I will also be adding highlights where they're not needed. Now another consideration as well is I took this photograph of my horse just as the winter was starting to approach. So he started to develop a little bit more of that woollier, fluffier coat. So the inner parts of his ears are particularly fluffy. So again, these are all considerations that we need to take into account when we are drawing the various elements on that portrait. Now when it comes to the forelock and the mane, this is one of those sections where it can become quite overwhelming. There are a lot of layers here. There's a mixture of highlights and shadows. But the one thing that I focus on in the real-time tutorial on Patreon is how to break up a section like this and make it far easier to tackle. And with any element, but especially something like the mane or the forelock where it's quite significantly longer and thicker looking, I will really break up that reference photo into individual layers. And again, this is something that I really did focus on in that Patreon tutorial. What we want to be doing is working with the hair that is at the base foundation closer to the skin and working up from there. It is really important to make sure here that we do that sort of layering process in order to build up more depth in that fur texture. If we start mapping in the details that are sitting on the very top, we are going to have a very two-dimensional feel to that section of the portrait. And obviously we are going for the opposite. We want this to look like a three-dimensional drawing on that flat paper surface. Now in order to do that, it is all based on those lights and darks. And this is why graphite is a wonderful medium to work with, because we are not relying on the colour part of that photograph to make more realism in that piece. Now, I'm a strong believer, as you know, if you've seen any of my other tutorials here, that the contrast plays more of a role than the exact colour. I've got hundreds of photographs of my horses, and all of the colour of those photographs are going to be slightly different depending on the light source, the time of day that was taken on, whether or not a flash was used. There are so many different things that affect the colour. But the one thing that I will be making sure of from start to finish is my contrasts. You want your shadows dark and your highlights bright. So something else that I really do focus on throughout all of my tutorials, both on Patreon and here on YouTube, is the importance of the order of layers. Now, I always like to draw what is behind an element first because that looks more natural. If you've got the forelock in between the two ears, all that lovely longer hair, and you draw that first, and then we try drawing in the hair on the face after, we are then layering those in the wrong order, because it's going to potentially look like the hair on the face is then drawn on top of the forelock or the mane. So we do want to make sure that we have captured the layer in the right order. So what I will do, as you can see here, is I'm now starting to get a very subtle base foundation, and I'm going to start working on the white marking between the eyes. I'm adding in all of the detail, and once I've done that and I'm happy with the section of the face, that's when I can finish off all of that lovely long forelock. And again, I do feel that this is something else, along with all of the other techniques that I've mentioned. This is another way of achieving more depth in the piece. Another reason why I like working like this is, let's say all of those longer parts of the forelock that I have just added in were drawn first. I would then have to draw all of my lighter details for the white marking between the eyes around all of those longer lines. That potentially is going to create some harsh edges and some very odd looking pencil strokes. It does sometimes then look very obvious that the parts of the face have been drawn separately on top of that forelock, and I really don't want to have that look in any of my portraits. So I will study a reference photo and think what is behind that element and work on that first. For instance, this section here below the eye, there are some sections of the forelock that are going to be overlapping. It might only be 2 or 3 strands, but there are some of those longer hairs that are going to be in front of this section or on top. So I do want to make sure that I've got all of the parts of the face done first in any of those areas where those longer hairs are going to be. So when I was happy with the top section of the head, I then start working on the lower part of his face. Again, the same principle here, where I'm mapping in my main lights and darks. Horses are very unique in their face and skull structure, so I do want to make sure that I hint at any subtle change in my shadows and my highlights. Now, I know this is something that I've really spoken about a lot throughout this tutorial, but when drawing horses, it makes a real difference. Underneath the skin, they have little veins, they've got bits of cartilage, the skull is shaped and formed in a very different way to cats and dogs. So we do want to make sure that we've really put in and closely studied all of those subtle mid-tone shadows, highlights, darkest shadows, any tonal values that have a slight shift. And it is the placement of these very subtle changes in the lights and darks that's going to make this face look three-dimensional. And again, that is all about my focus here when I'm working with graphite. I am, of course, really wanting to capture as much detail as I can, but we can have all the detail in the world. But if our darks aren't dark enough and the lights aren't bright enough, it's just not going to have the same impact. So before I progress onto the neck and the mane section, if the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video so far have been useful, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I'd be very, very grateful. So when it comes to drawing fur, I've got quite a few videos here on YouTube, and it's packed full of tips for drawing realistic fur in graphite. If they're of interest, I will link them in the description below. But a few things that I do focus on in those tutorials when it comes to pencil technique are fur direction, fur thickness, and fur length. This is all going to depend on how we use that pencil, down to how sharp that point is, whereabouts on that pencil you're holding it, how much pressure is being applied. There are so many different things that can affect the type of pencil stroke we create. And this is why I now upload all of my tutorials to Patreon in real time with a voiceover while I'm working, so that then every decision, the reason behind some of the techniques that I'm using are explained in the moment at the time. Because I might decide to sharpen my pencil or maybe file down my point because I need to work with a blunter pencil. Those things there are something that I do decide in that moment with that one section of fur or hair that I am working on. Now when it came to working on the mane, this is where those three main pencil techniques come into play: fur direction, fur thickness and fur length. All of them here are changing drastically compared to the face. So I don't want to make all of my pencil strokes travelling in the same direction because I'm going to end up with a very artificial and fake looking mane. I really don't want that. I'm also here starting to draw in parts of the neck first because the mane needs to overlap these sections, going back to what I've mentioned with those order of the layers. And again here, this is why I have to work on the body, because this horse's mane is so long that it actually comes right down past his shoulder. So I had to make sure that all of this section of the portrait was finished before I could work on the mane. And depending on the reference photograph, you might not actually need to add a huge amount of detail to the chest area if you do want it to look a little bit out of focus. Lots of shading techniques and very subtle details is usually enough. Once I'd achieved that, that's when I can then finish working on those really long pencil strokes. Once I've got a good base foundation in, I'm going to start adding in some of my highlights. I can then go back reinforcing my contrast. Now I always recommend to take a step back from your work when you get to this stage and add in those tiny fine details, like these hairs on the edge of the face and of course the whiskers. Now the whiskers overlap everything else, so they do need to be left until that last layer. It's really important. So I do hope the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video have been useful. If they were, as I say, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. And if you would like to draw along to this real-time tutorial on Patreon, my Patreon is linked in the description below. As always, if you've got any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I am more than happy to help if I can. And I'll be uploading another video in the next few days. And as always, thank you so much for watching.